Before we begin, I want you to stop whatever you are doing and listen very carefully, because what I am about to share with you is not just a story. It is a truth that was buried beneath floorboards for over 170 years. It is a truth wrapped in cracked leather and written in faded ink by a hand that trembled, not from age, not from cold, but from fear. The kind of fear that lives in your chest like a stone that never dissolves, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many prayers you whisper into the dark. In the summer of 2019, a woman named Clara Beaumont was clearing out the old Hargrove estate in rural Virginia, a crumbling plantation house known locally as simply the Big House, when her shovel struck something beneath the rotting floorboards of what had once been the servants' quarters. It was a tin box, rusted shut, sealed as if by the deliberate hand of someone who understood that what was inside could not be allowed to simply vanish into silence. Inside that box was a diary, small, brown, the cover warped by decades of moisture, and on the first page, written in a careful, elegant hand that had clearly been trained in secret, were these words: "If you are reading this, then God has answered the prayer I no longer had the courage to speak aloud. My name is Josephine, and this is what they did not want the world to know." What followed in those pages would shake the Hargrove family legacy to its foundation, unravel a century-old lie that had been polished and presented as local history, and ultimately lead to a reckoning that nobody in that quiet Virginia county had ever expected to face. But more than any of that, it would tell the story of a woman who had nothing except her words, and who somehow understood that words, properly preserved, are the most indestructible weapon a human being can possess. Stay with me, because this story does not end the way you think it ends, and neither does it begin the way you might expect. Chapter 1, The Woman Behind the Wall's Hook. Into Chapter 1, you are about to meet Josephine. She was 23 years old in 1851. She could not legally own her name. She could not legally claim her child. And yet, on the night of February the 14th, Valentine's Day, of all the bitter ironies the universe could offer, she sat beneath a single tallow candle in a windowless room, no larger than a modern bathroom, and she began to write. Not because she believed anyone would read it in her lifetime, but because she could not bear the thought of all of it simply disappearing. This chapter is the story of how a woman with nothing found the most profound kind of power, and it will break your heart before it puts it back together. The Hargrove estate sat on 1,100 acres of Virginia tobacco country, and in 1851, it was considered one of the finest properties in the entire county. Colonel Elias Hargrove was a man of considerable reputation, a churchgoer, a magistrate, a man whose name appeared in the county records with the frequency and weight of someone who understood that history is written by those with the ink and the leisure to write it. His wife, Margaret, was celebrated for her charity work. Their portrait hung in the county hall. Their children attended the finest schools. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Hargrove estate was a picture of prosperity, order, and Southern gentility. But Josephine had never been allowed to look in from the outside. She had only ever known the inside. The back rooms, the kitchen passages, the servants' quarters where 6 people slept in spaces designed for storage. She had been born on the estate in 1828, the daughter of a woman named Ruth, who had herself been born on that same soil. Josephine had never known any other world. She had grown up watching the Big House from a distance, its white columns catching the morning light, its wide veranda where the Hargrove family took their evening lemonade. And she had learned, very early in life, that there were 2 entirely different realities existing simultaneously on those 1,100 acres, and the distance between them was not measured in yards. What made Josephine different, what made her dangerous, though she would not have used that word for herself, was that she could read. This was not a small thing in 1851. It was, in many states, a crime. She had learned in secret, taught by a young white woman named Eleanor Marsh, the daughter of a neighboring family, who had spent 2 years as a kind of informal companion to the Hargrove household before her family moved west. Eleanor had been 17, idealistic in the way that only the very young and the very sheltered can be, and she had taught Josephine letters with a childlike conviction that knowledge was simply a gift one person gave to another, as natural as sharing bread. Eleanor had moved away without fully understanding what she had left behind. Josephine had never forgotten her. For years, Josephine's literacy was her most closely guarded secret. She read whatever she could find, discarded newspapers, the backs of seed catalogs, letters that were left carelessly on kitchen tables. She absorbed words like a woman dying of thirst, absorbs water deeply, desperately, with the full understanding that this was the one thing nobody could take from her as long as she never let them know she had it. She never spoke of it. She never let anyone see her lips moving when she read. She kept it folded inside herself like a flame cupped against the wind. In the spring of 1849, when Josephine was 21 years old, a man named Samuel was brought to the Hargrove estate. He was tall, quiet, with large, careful hands and eyes that assessed every room he entered the way a man assesses a room he might one day need to escape from. He had come from a plantation in Georgia, sold and transported with the casual efficiency of livestock, and he carried with him the particular stillness of someone who had learned that every emotion displayed is a vulnerability that can be used against you. Josephine noticed him on his first day. He noticed her on his second. By the end of his first month, they had found the language that people who are not permitted to speak freely always find: small gestures, shared glances, the elaborate silent grammar of two people constructing a private world inside a hostile one. They fell in love with the slow, devastating certainty of people who understand that happiness is borrowed time. They found moments, stolen quarter hours in the kitchen garden, brief conversations in the passage between the main house and the smokehouse. And they built from those scraps of time something that felt, to both of them, like the most real thing in a world composed almost entirely of unreality. By the winter of 1850, Josephine was carrying Samuel's child. This was when the diary began. Not immediately. She did not begin writing until February of 1851, after the thing had happened that she could not speak about, could not cry about publicly, could not in any way acknowledge in the language of grief that the world around her would have recognized as grief. She began writing because Samuel was gone. He had been sold in January of 1851. On a Tuesday morning, with 2 days' notice, and no explanation offered to anyone who might have wanted one, Josephine had stood in the yard and watched him walk to the wagon that would carry him to the auction house in Richmond, and he had turned once, just once, and looked at her with an expression she would spend the rest of her life trying to accurately describe in those diary pages. She wrote, "He looked at me the way a man looks at the sun when he knows he is going underground, not with despair, with the specific sorrow of someone memorizing something they love, because memory is the only form of keeping that cannot be confiscated. The diary entries in those first weeks are almost unbearable in their restraint." Josephine was not a woman who permitted herself the luxury of uncontrolled emotion on paper, perhaps because she understood that paper can be found, and found emotion is evidence of an inner life, and an inner life is the thing that those who held power over her most needed to deny her. So she wrote with a discipline that is, in its own way, more devastating than any wail of anguish could be. She recorded facts. She recorded the weather. She recorded what she ate and what tasks she was assigned. And then, threaded through all of that meticulous accounting of the external world, she wrote the truth. She wrote about Samuel. She wrote about the child growing inside her. She wrote about the night she had told him she was expecting, and how he had been silent for a long moment, and then said very quietly that if it was a girl, he would like her to be named after the river he had grown up near in Georgia, the Altamaha. Josephine had laughed. she wrote, because it was an enormous name for a small baby. And Samuel had said that enormous names were exactly what small babies needed, because the world was going to spend its entire effort trying to make them feel small, and at least their name could resist. The child was born in April of 1851. A girl, Josephine named her Alma, a compromise, she explained in the diary, between the river Samuel had loved and the word that meant soul, because the child was both. The last current of the love they had built together, and the visible proof that Josephine's inner life was real, whatever the world around her insisted. But here is where the dark secret of the big house begins to take shape. Because Alma, from the first weeks of her life, drew the attention of Margaret Hargrove in a way that Josephine had not anticipated and could not have defended against. Margaret Hargrove was a woman who had lost 2 infants in the 5 years prior, and who had been told by the county physician that it was unlikely she would carry another child to term. She was a woman of fierce emotional architecture, composed on the surface, volcanic underneath. And she had transferred the enormous force of her frustrated maternal love onto a series of small objects. A lapdog, a rose garden, a collection of porcelain figurines from Europe that she dusted herself every Thursday morning as if the act of caring were itself the point. When she saw Alma, something shifted in Margaret Hargrove that had no name in the polite vocabulary available to women of her station. Josephine noticed it first as a kind of increased attention, Margaret finding reasons to be in the kitchen quarters, asking after the baby with a specificity that went beyond the cursory interest of an employer. Then it became something else. Alma began being brought to the main house in the afternoons. A crib appeared in the nursery. Margaret began referring to the baby using a diminutive, a pet name, as if renaming her were a way of owning her. Josephine wrote about this with a controlled, terrible precision. She wrote, "She does not see a child. She sees a vacancy she intends to fill. And because she has the power to fill it, she believes that makes it right. The challenge that Josephine Pfaff, ate was one of the most impossible calculus problems a human being can be asked to solve. She loved her daughter with the full force of a love that had nowhere else to go. Samuel was gone. Her mother Ruth had died the previous winter, and Alma was the last living thing on earth that was entirely, unambiguously hers. And yet she had no legal standing. She had no rights over the child she had carried and delivered and nursed. In the eyes of the law that governed their world, Alma belonged to Colonel Hargrove, the way the tobacco in the field belonged to him, as property, as investment, as an asset whose disposition was entirely at his discretion. She could not scream. She could not run. She could not appeal to any authority, because the authority in their world was the very problem she was trying to survive. What she could do, what she did, night after night, in the 45 minutes between the end of her duties and the time she was expected to be silent, was right. She wrote everything. She wrote the dates and the times and the names. She wrote about the conversation she overheard through the thin walls of the big house, the discussions between Elias and Margaret about Alma's future, conducted with the bureaucratic calmness of people making administrative decisions. She wrote about the Colonel's business dealings, about the debt she had heard referenced in hushed conversations, about a particular arrangement involving a neighboring landowner named Colston that seemed to have implications beyond the merely financial. She wrote about the things she witnessed that had no witnesses except her. She was building, though she may not have fully understood it yet, a record. She was creating evidence. One night in October of 1851, Josephine wrote what Clara Beaumont would later describe, when she finally read the diary in full, as the single most heartbreaking passage she had ever encountered in any document, historical or otherwise. "I rocked Alma tonight for 1 hour. I counted. She fell asleep against my shoulder at the 37th minute, and I held her for the remaining 23 because I understand, in the part of myself that knows things before they happen, that I am being counted down to something. I do not know the number I am counting down to. I know only that I am counting. She smells of the soap they use in the big house now. She is beginning to forget my smell. I wonder sometimes if a child can forget a mother's smell before she has learned enough language to remember her face. I wonder if forgetting happens in silence, the way the most important things always seem to happen. Not in the moments of noise and crisis, but in the long, quiet stretches in between, when nobody is watching and nobody is recording, and the world just slowly, gently rearranges itself into something unrecognizable. By November of 1851, Josephine understood that her time with Alma was ending. The diary entries become shorter in this period, more precise, as if she were conserving something. She began including specific details with a new kind of deliberateness. Names, dates, amounts, descriptions of papers she had seen on the colonel's desk during her cleaning duties. She was, consciously now, assembling a case. She did not know for what court. She did not know for what judge. She wrote in one entry, "I do not know who will read these words or when. I know only that words properly hidden have a way of surviving the people who need them silenced. I am writing this for the future. I am writing this for a world I will not live to see, which will be, God willing, a world that can do something with the truth." She hid the diary on a night in late November, during the first real cold snap of the season, when she could hear the rest of T.E. household settled and silent. She wrapped it in oilcloth she had saved from the kitchen stores. She placed it in a tin box she had found in the rubbish pile behind the smokehouse. She pried up a floorboard in the corner of her room, a board that had always been slightly loose, that she had always meant to report, and never had, and she placed the box in the earth beneath it. She pressed the board back into place with both hands, kneeling in the dark. Then she sat back on her heels and she stayed there for a long time, not moving, not crying, just breathing in the cold air of that small room with her hands flat on the floor above everything she had ever dared to say out loud. She was 23 years old. She had written, in 9 months of secret labor, 147 pages. She had not signed a single page with anything other than her first name, because she understood that the only power she had was the power of someone who cannot entirely be located. She left the diary to the future, and then she went back to work. Chapter 2. The Reckoning Hook. Into Chapter 2. Here is the question that Chapter 1 left buried in that Virginia earth, alongside the tin box. What happens when the truth finally surfaces? Not in a court, not in a confessional, not in the carefully managed conditions of a reconciliation commission where everyone has agreed in advance to behave, but in the raw, unprepared, uncontrolled middle of an ordinary woman's ordinary Tuesday, when a shovel hits something hard and the past decides that it has waited long enough. What does justice look like when the person who was wronged is 140 years in the ground? And what does it do to the people who discover they have been living their entire lives on top of a lie? This chapter is about all of those questions, and it is also about a woman named Clara who did not scat to be the one who had to answer them, but who answered them anyway. Clara Beaumont was 44 years old when she found the diary, and she had spent most of those 44 years being the kind of person who finishes things other people leave undone. She was a historical preservationist, not the glamorous kind who appears on television in linen jackets, but the practical kind who spends her days in rubber boots negotiating with local government bodies about drainage and rot damage and the particular bureaucratic agony of getting a crumbling building onto the historic register before a developer's bulldozer makes the question moot. She was methodical. She was unsentimental about most things. She had learned that sentimentality is a luxury that preservation work cannot afford, because if you weep over every beautiful thing that is dying, you will never have time to save any of them. She had been hired by a regional preservation foundation to assess the Hargrove estate, which had sat vacant for 11 years following the death of the last direct Hargrove descendant, a man named Robert Hargrove III, who had maintained the property with the grim obligation of someone who had inherited both a building and a responsibility he had never asked for. Robert had died without children. His estate had been tied up in legal proceedings for 3 years before being transferred, with conditions, to the foundation. Clara had been brought in to determine what was structurally salvageable. She had been on the property for 4 days when her shovel found the tin box. She almost did not open it. This is important, and Clara has said so publicly on several occasions since. She almost set it aside for the Foundation's archivist to deal with because she was running behind schedule and the subfloor in the East Wing was showing signs of termite damage that needed to be documented, before the afternoon light changed. She held the box in her gloved hands for almost a full minute, feeling the weight of it. Feeling the weight of it. And then something she has described as instinct, but which might also have been the accumulated attentiveness of 2 decades of working with old things, made her sit down in the dust and pry the lid open. She read the first page. Then she sat very still for a long time. Then she began to read the second page. She did not leave the building until she had read all 147 pages. It took her until well past dark. She read by the light of her work lantern. Sitting on a piece of salvaged lumber in the ruins of what had once been Josephine's room, and as the Virginia night settled in around her and the old house made its repertoire of old house sounds, she read every word that Josephine had written into the silence of 1851. By the time she finished, she understood that she was holding something that could not be quietly catalogued and filed away in an archive box. The diary was not merely a personal document. It was testimony. Josephine had recorded, with extraordinary specificity, the details of what had happened to Alma, the systematic transfer of the child from her mother to the Hargrove household, conducted over a period of months with the deliberate incremental patience of people who understood that sudden actions invite resistance, but slow erosion is almost irresistible. She had documented the legal instruments involved. A deed of transfer, she called it, that she had seen on the colonel's desk, signed by Elias and witnessed by the neighboring landowner Colston, that formalized what had until that point been a merely practical arrangement. She had also recorded something that made Clara's blood run cold, even 170 years later. Josephine had written that Margaret Hargrove, in a moment of extraordinary realisness that Josephine had witnessed through a cracked door, had told her husband that she intended to present Alma, renamed, repapered, absorbed into the household, as a child she had adopted from a cousin's family in North Carolina. She had already written the letters. She had already arranged the story. Alma was to be erased as Josephine's daughter and reconstructed as something else entirely, and the reconstruction was to be so complete that not even Alma herself would ever know the difference. Clara sat in the dark with that knowledge and felt the particular vertigo of someone who has just discovered that the ground they are standing on is not ground at all. The days that followed were among the most complicated of Clara's professional and personal life. She had the diary authenticated by 3 separate specialists: the ink, the paper, the handwriting, all consistent with the mid-19th century. She brought in a historian from the University of Virginia who specialized in antebellum Virginia records, a quiet man named Dr. Marcus Webb, who spent 2 weeks in the county archives, and emerged with a face that told Clara everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth to say it. He had found the deed of transfer. He had found the letters Margaret had written to the fictitious North Carolina cousin. He had found, buried in the county birth records, in an entry that had clearly been altered with a different ink at a later date, a record of a child who matched Alma's description, whose listed parentage had been changed. He had also found, in the estate records of a Hargrove heir from the early 20th century, A will that referenced a family line tracing directly back to a child listed as Adelaide Hargrove, adopted 1852. Adelaide, another rename, another erasure. The implications were staggering and immediate. There were living descendants of the Hargrove line who did not know they were also descendants of Josephine. There were people alive today whose family history had been constructed on a foundation of deliberate deception. There were people who had been told one story about who they were and where they came from. And that story was a lie built on an injustice, and the lie had been so successfully maintained for so long that it had calcified into the kind of truth that nobody thinks to question, because nobody has ever had reason to. The nearest living Hargrove descendant, it turned out, was a woman named Patricia Aldridge, 61 years old, a retired schoolteacher living in Richmond. She had no idea Clara existed until Clara called her on a Wednesday morning in September of 2019 and asked, with the careful gentleness of someone delivering information they know will change a person's life, if she had some time to talk. The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. Clara has never publicly disclosed everything that was said in that call, and Patricia Aldridge has given only one interview in the years since, in which she said, simply say, that the call had been the most disorienting experience of her life, and also, eventually, the most important. What Patricia did publicly was remarkable. She did not deny the diary. She did not call it a fabrication, as some of the more defensive corners of local historical society initially suggested. She did not retreat into the comfortable narcotic of family pride. She sat with what she had been told, and she sat with it for 6 weeks, and then she hired her own historian and her own genealogist, and she asked them to find everything they could find. She wanted, she said, to know the truth of her own story, even the parts of it that had been locked under floorboards for 170 years. What her team found only confirmed and expanded what Dr. Webb had documented. Adelaide Hargrove, Alma Josephine's daughter, the child who had been renamed and reconstructed and handed a false history the way you hand a child a toy, as if the lie were itself a kindness, had grown up in the Hargrove household, had married a man named Thomas Aldridge in 1874, and had lived out her life in Virginia without, as far as any record could establish, ever knowing who her mother truly was. She had died in 1921. She had never known about the diary. She had never known about Josephine's 9 months of secret testimony, wrapped in oilcloth under a floorboard, waiting. Patricia Aldridge learned all of this, and then she did something that Clara Beaumont, when she describes it, still struggles to talk about without her voice changing. Patricia contacted the African American Historical and Genealogical Organization in the county and asked for their help in finding any living descendants of Josephine, by which she meant through any children Josephine may have had after 1851, since Alma had been taken. The search took 8 months. It found 3 families. The meeting between those families and Patricia Aldridge took place in the spring of 2021 in the restored main hall of the Hargrove estate, now in the process of being converted into a heritage and education center with a permanent exhibition dedicated to the lives of the people who had lived and worked and been silenced there. Clara Beaumont had organized the event with the same methodical competence she brought to everything, and she had stood at the back of the room and watched it happen. She has said that she has no adequate words for what that room felt like. A woman named Denise, one of Josephine's descendants, a 40-year-old nurse from Northern Virginia with Josephine's same careful eyes, according to the single photograph of Josephine that had been found in the estate's records, St. Stood up and read aloud from the diary. The passage she chose was the one Josephine had written about rocking Alma in the 37th minute. The room was completely silent for the entirety of the reading. When Denise sat down, she and Patricia Aldridge looked at each other across the 30 feet of restored hardwood floor that separated them, and after a long moment, Patricia crossed the room. What passed between them in that moment is their own. But Clara, watching from the back, understood that she was witnessing the resolution of something that had been left incomplete for 170 years. A conversation that Josephine had begun in the dark of a November night in 1851, a conversation that the world had not been ready to have, that had been sealed in a tin box and handed to the future with the specific faith of someone who believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that the future would eventually be better equipped to receive it. The Heritage Center opened to the public in October of 2022. The first room visitors enter is not the grand main hall, not the Colonel's study, not the beautifully restored parlor with its period furniture. The first room is the servants' quarters. It has been restored to its 1851 condition with the same attention and resources that went into every other room of the estate. In the corner of that small room, under a section of the original floorboard preserved behind glass, is the outline of the space where the tin box was found. Disturbing medical case study. Beside it, on the wall, is a full-size reproduction of the diary's first page, printed in Josephine's own hand, large enough to read without leaning forward. Below it, on a small plaque, are the words, "She wrote this for a world she would not live to see. We are that world. Let us be worthy of it." There is one more thing. In Josephine's last diary entry, written the night before she hid it, she returns for a final moment to Samuel. She writes that she does not know where he is. She writes that she hopes he is alive. She writes that if he ever found a way to think about her across whatever distance separated them, she hoped he understood that she had done everything she could, that she had used every tool available to her, that she had not been silent. And then she wrote this, which Clara Beaumont read aloud at the opening of the Heritage Center and which has since been quoted in every article and documentary that has told this story. I have no power over what happens next. I have only these words, and the faith that words, given enough time and enough darkness and enough silence to travel through, eventually find the light they were written toward. I am not writing for today. I am writing for the day when today is finally over. The day she wrote those words, Josephine was 23 years old, alone and completely without power in every way that the world she lived in measured power. She had a candle, a borrowed pen, and 147 pages of oilcloth-wrapped truth. It turned out to be enough.